Once upon a time, there was a boy called Brian. And Brian was a year one type of a boy. He lived in the flat with his mum, and he'd been to many schools because his mum had had to move all around. But now he was new, and he was new in his school. His mum brought him down to the school, and he kept hanging on to his mum's hand. And he said, "Mum, don't go. Brian, it's going to be okay. All right, all right." Well, the teacher was kind, and she brought Brian in, and all the children were on the carpet. And the teacher said, "Well, everybody, this is a new boy in the class, and his name is Brian. And what do we do with new children?" Well, one boy put his hand up. Miss, I know. We're really kind to new children." "That's right, Gregory. We're kind." "Okay, Brian, are you packed lunch or school dinner?" And Brian, he was too shy even to say. So Miss got the register and said, "Well, Brian, you're a school dinner today." Well, at break time, Brian went out to play. Some of the girls, they wanted to play with Brian, but Brian said, "No, thanks, I'll just watch." And he leaned up against the wall of the playground wearing his coat, and he watched the other children play. And then there were three children that were right next to him. One was called Nana, one was called Tara, and one was called James. And Nana said to the other two, "Hey, guess what, yeah. You know my dad, yeah. My dad drives a lorry, and my dad has driven all the way to France." "Whoa," said James. "Whoa," said Tara. And then Tara said, "Well, guess what? You know my dad? My dad is a postman, and my dad delivers letters. My dad has delivered letters to the Queen." "Whoa," said Nana. "Whoa," said James. And then James said, "Well, guess what? You know my dad? My dad's a DJ." "Whoa," said the girls. Now Brian was listening to the children. He'd like to say something. He'd like to be able to talk. But the problem was, he didn't know what his dad did because he didn't know his dad. So he decided to make things up. And he said, "Well, guess what? "What is it?" said Nana. "What is it?" said Tara. "What is it?" said James. "Well, you know my dad," said Brian. "My dad plays football for Manchester United." "Whoa," said James. "Whoa," said Nana. "Whoa," said Tara. And they said, "Brian, come and play with us." So they chased around a little bit, and Brian chased them. And then they chased Brian. And then Nana said, "Hey, Brian, if your dad plays for Manchester United, all football players are millionaires, so why do you still live in the flats?" And Tara said, "Brian, if your dad plays for Manchester United, why does your mum bring you to school?" And then James said, "Brian, if your dad plays for Manchester United, how come you haven't got a stretch limo?" And Brian knew. They knew he'd lied, and he turned and he ran to the boys' toilets and he never came out. And all that day he didn't speak to anybody. And when he had to go to the playground again, he leaned against the wall and he wanted to push himself right back into the bricks and just disappear. Well, that afternoon after school, Mum came to pick him up, and he held Mum's hand, and they were walking out of school. And Tara was behind, and Tara was talking to her dad. And Tara said, "Manchester United." Brian knew they were talking about him, so he dragged his mother's hand quickly. "Mom, let's go home." When they got home and Brian was safe, Mum said, "Did you have a nice day at school?" And Brian went, Why, Brian, why? Because, Mom, I lied. You lied, Brian? What lie did you tell? I said my dad plays for Manchester United. Oh, Brian, that's not a lie. You just made up a story. And anyway, well, who brings you to swimming, Brian? You do, Mum. And who makes you your special treat on a Thursday? You do, Mum. And who tells you your favorite special story every night? You do, Mum. So what would you rather have? Swimming, special treat, special story, or Manchester United? Brian thought about it. He didn't want to lie, so he said, Manchester United. Oh, Brian, go and get into your pajamas and I'll tell you your special story. Brian got into bed and pulled the blanket up to his chin, and Mum came in and she began the story. It was the same story every night. Once there was a hero, and his name was Brian, and he had a big sword that his dad had given him. And one day the king summoned Brian. Brian, I have summoned you because you are a hero and very brave. Brian, a dragon has come to the kingdom, and he lives up on the mountain. Brian, I want you to go and kill the dragon. Brian said, yes, Your Highness, I will go now. So he got onto his horse, went to the mountain, and then got off his horse, because as he made his way up the path, all the flowers were dead. All the trees had been burnt, and it smelt of sulfur and burnt things. When he got to the dragon's cave, he knew the dragon was inside. He got out his dad's sword, zing, and he said, Dragon, come out. I'm going to kill you. Well, the dragon's big face came out of the darkness. Brian looked up at his beautiful green eyes, and Brian saw that there was a tear coming down, running down the dragon's face. And Brian said, what's the matter with you? And the dragon said, I'm lonely because I haven't got no mum and dad, and I haven't got no friends. Well, Brian looked at the dragon and said, well, guess what? I'll be your friend. Brian, put the sword back in. Shoo! And the dragon said, good, we can play. You can run on my back. Brian ran up the dragon's back and slid down the dragon's tail. It was just like a ride. He had to be careful of the dragon's leathery wings. And then the dragon said, hey, Brian, do you want to fly on my back? And Brian said, yeah. So Brian made sure he was secure on the dragon's neck, and he held on to the dragon's scales. The dragon's leathery wings came up. And as they flapped, the dust came up and Brian couldn't see. And Brian said, Dragon, when are we going to take off? And the dragon said, Brian, we're already flying. And Brian looked down from the dragon's back, and down there he said, I can see my school. I can see my house. I can. But always, by that time, the real Brian was fast asleep, and Mum tiptoed out of the room. The next day at school, they were all on the carpet looking at Miss. And Miss said, well, we've got a very special day today because we've got a special visitor. Oh, said Nana. Is it a policeman? No, Nana, it's not a policeman. Oh, said Tara. Is it a fireman? No, unfortunately, it's not a fireman, Tara. And then James looked at the teacher and said, is it going to be the head teacher? Again? No, it's not going to be the head teacher. You're going to have to wait to find out. Everybody get out to play. And everybody ran around except Brian. And then they all came back in and sat on the carpet. And the door at the back opened. Here's our special visitor, said the teacher. And when Brian looked round, she saw it was his mum. What's she doing here? Mum came up to the front, sat down and said, now, I'm going to tell you a story. It's called Brian the Brave. Brian said, she's going to tell my story, my story. Well, Mum began to tell the story, and halfway through, Brian looked around at all the other children listening, and all the other children were like this. At the end of the story, everyone clapped Mum, but they turned to Brian and they said, hey, Brian, is it true? Is it real? Brian didn't want to lie. So Brian said, no, it's not true. It's just a story. And they all said, wow, Brian's in a story. Well, that day when Mum came to collect him, he was holding her hand. And as he walked out, Tara was behind him talking to her dad. And she said this, Brian is in a story. Well, Brian's shoulders went back, his chest puffed out, his chin jutted forward, and he was proud and not shy anymore because he was in a story. And that is the end of the story.